I was scrolling through my feed the other night, and like clockwork, those two familiar faces popped up again.
Oh, I know exactly who you mean.
Right. You've likely seen them. Two elderly Singaporean gentlemen, impeccably dressed, just speaking in these incredibly measured Oxbridge-adjacent tones.
Yeah, the kind of voices that make even the most provocative geopolitical claims sound like, just simple common sense.
Exactly. One of them has this air of a Zen master of diplomacy, and the other is this sharp-eyed intellectual who seems to take a quiet, almost professional joy in making Western journalists look like confused schoolboys.
It is quite the performance to watch.
It really is. And to their millions of viewers, they are essentially the grandfathers of neutrality. They're these wise men from a small island calmly explaining why the American era is fading and why the Asian century is just an unstoppable natural force.
Which is a very compelling narrative.
It's extremely compelling. But as I watched them lean back in those leather chairs, just radiating this objective wisdom, I couldn't help but think about the files from 2009.
Ah, yes. The 2009 pivot. That really changes the context, doesn't it?
It changes everything. Because back then, these exact same men weren't giving viral lectures about Western overreach. They were the ones in the back rooms of Washington, practically begging the Americans to stay.
Yeah, they were literally the architects of the pivot to Asia.
Exactly. They were building naval bases for U.S. aircraft carriers. They were championing these massive trade deals specifically designed to structurally box out the very neighbors they now praise.
And if you look even further back, the history gets even more complicated.
Way more complicated. I mean, the very gleaming skyscrapers that form their neutral backdrop today, those were basically lubricated by the American war machine.
Literally fueled by the blood and oil of the Vietnam War.
Right. That conflict provided the miracle capital for the island's rise.
Right.
So this instantaneous shift from being the U.S. military's most loyal gas station in the East to suddenly becoming the most articulate critics of U.S. hegemony. I mean, that isn't just a change of heart.
No, it's a masterclass in high-stakes brokerage.
It made me realize that when these men speak on our screens today, they aren't just offering insight. They are actively managing a global investment portfolio where the primary currency is influence.
And it raises a pretty chilling question for this deep dive.
Is this nation actually the honest bridge it claims to be? Or is it just the most sophisticated double agent in history, effectively selling us the very fire it helped light?
Well, to really unpack that juxtaposition, we have to completely dismantle the polished branding that surrounds the island today.
The organic tech miracle narrative.
Exactly. The gleaming skylines, the pristine automated ports, the seamless flow of global capital. They project this image of a totally organic, inevitable economic miracle.
Like it's just the natural endpoint of having smart administrators and free trade.
Right, but that sleek exterior completely obscures the visceral mechanical reality of how the nation actually started. Their foundational survival mechanism wasn't just clever trade. It was a highly calculated capitalization on the sheer brute force of foreign military presence.
At its inception, the Republic was practically engineered as a war economy.
It was. And I know war economy is a really heavy term to use.
Yeah, usually when we talk about post-colonial success stories, the narrative is all about, throwing off the shackles of the empire and proudly building indigenous industries from scratch.
But the situation in the late 1960s wasn't some joyous celebration of newfound sovereignty. It was sheer, unadulterated economic panic.
I mean, let's look at the geography of their vulnerability in 1968. The British military bases on the island weren't just colonial outposts.
No, they were the central engine of the entire local economy.
Great Britain was injecting nearly $200 million annually just to maintain those installations. That was roughly 20% of the gross national product.
20%. That's an unimaginable chunk of an economy today.
It directly employed 36,000 citizens. So when the British government announced their East of Suez withdrawal policy, saying they were completely pulling out by 1971, it was an absolute disaster.
It wasn't independence, it was a death sentence.
Exactly. Suddenly you have 150,000 livelihoods hanging by a thread, especially when you factor in the families and the indirect economy around those bases.
And for a microstate with literally zero natural resources, they didn't even have their own water supply, the margin for error was completely non-existent.
Mass unemployment and total economic collapse were the baseline projections. The leadership was staring right into the abyss.
Which is what makes their next move look less like an economic miracle and more like an incredibly ruthless, calculated pivot.
Because right as the British are packing up their bags and sailing west, the American military machine in Indochina was rapidly escalating.
The timing is almost frighteningly perfect.
By 1967, 15% of the national income was being derived directly from U.S. military procurement for the Vietnam War. They didn't just find a new trading partner, they transformed the entire island into the regional petroleum refining center for the U.S. military.
Massive industrial players like Lockheed Corporation set up these sprawling operations just for aircraft repair, right there on the island.
Yeah, and by 1971, the exact year the British finally left, private foreign investment had skyrocketed to $100 million a year. The foundations of modern Singapore were literally built on the capital of a conflict raging hundreds of miles away.
There's a geopolitical framework articulated by the scholar Michael Leifer that captures this perfectly. He argued that the legacy of this specific political genesis demands a perpetual assumption of vulnerability.
Meaning the future of the state can never, ever be taken for granted.
Exactly. It cemented this ideology where survival totally relies on making yourself absolutely indispensable to the most powerful and often the most destructive forces operating in your hemisphere.
It almost sounds like an institutionalized paranoia.
It's institutionalized paranoia.
But I struggle a bit with that term. It sounds so abstract, like something you debate in a graduate political science seminar. How does a society actually internalize that?
Well, how do you build a culture where everyone knows your wealth is inextricably linked to the neighborhood being somewhat on fire?
Yeah, exactly. It's wild to think about.
You see it most clearly not in the grand political speeches, but in the actual lived experiences of the generation that built that transition. Let me paint a picture for you of a man named Robert.
Okay, let's hear about Robert.
So Robert is an elderly consultant now. He began his career in the muddy, really uncertain days of the late 60s, right when the British withdrawal threatened to turn everything into a ghost town.
The prime era of the panic.
Right. And recently, Robert was having drinks in a private lounge at the Fullerton Hotel. It's this incredibly opulent space. Polished mahogany, dim lighting, the quiet hum of immense generational wealth all around them.
Very high-end.
Extremely. And sitting across the table from him is a young tech entrepreneur, maybe late 20s. The younger guy is energetic, agitated, and he's complaining bitterly about modern geopolitical friction.
Export controls and regional tensions are messing up his hardware supply chains.
It's the classic modern tech bro complaint. This underlying expectation that globalism should just be a seamless, frictionless conveyor belt for getting his products to market.
Right, any friction is just an annoyance to be solved.
Exactly. So Robert just listens to this kid complain for a long time. He doesn't offer a polished lecture on grand strategy. He just sits there, his voice really raspy from decades of smoking, and he reaches across the table.
What does he do?
He points to these deep, faded, heavily calloused scars all across his own hands. Physical scars he earned as a young man working in the humid, deafening repair yards, literally fixing heavy American military hardware during the Vietnam War.
Wow. What a contrast.
And he looks right at this young entrepreneur and whispers, "You think this stability is natural, but we are a business built on the friction of others."
Built on the friction of others. Wow.
Yep.
That is a devastatingly honest way to describe a national economy.
It is the raw, unvarnished truth of their geopolitical DNA. Robert described that whole era of the 1970s not as some golden age of national pride, but as a period of profitable anxiety.
Profitable anxiety.
Yeah. They survived because they forced themselves to become the only reliable, highly functioning machine shop in a neighborhood that was completely engulfed in flames.
So for guys like Robert, all the sophisticated maneuvering of the public intellectuals we see online today, it's not about finding some high-minded objective truth.
It's entirely about maintaining that foundational brokerage power. Sitting in that luxurious hotel lounge, his vulnerability was knowing that the prosperity around them was a fragile, artificial construct.
It requires this constant, exhausting calibration just to ensure the island remains the indispensable neutral ground, right? So rivals can still dock their ships and do business.
But I know you want to push back on this concept of profitable anxiety.
Yeah. because there is a cold calculus here that feels almost impossible to maintain over multiple generations. I understand the baseline logic piece is good for regular business, but a well-managed war next door is highly lucrative.
As long as the sparks never land on your own roof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how do you train generations of policymakers and diplomats to view catastrophic regional friction purely as a leverage point for your own economic survival? It sounds almost sociopathic.
I get why it sounds that way, but it isn't sociopathy. It is the absolute supremacy of pragmatism over ideology, and it's driven entirely by geographic reality.
Geographic reality.
Yeah.
Because they're at the choke point of the Malacca Strait.
Right. When the alternative to this balancing act is total irrelevance and subsequent starvation, cognitive dissonance just becomes a luxury you cannot afford.
The elite class internalized a very specific mechanical reality about their location.
Their geography is their only inherent asset. If the entire region becomes perfectly harmonious and unified, the need for a middleman, a safe harbor, or a secure financial node just bypasses them entirely.
They just become another regular port.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if the region descends into total, uncontained kinetic war, they are physically destroyed.
So the optimal operational state for them is this persistent, carefully managed tension.
Managed tension is the perfect way to say it.
You know, it's not really a tightrope walk. I think a better analogy is a nuclear reactor. The reactor core is the geopolitical tension of the region. Right. If there's no reaction in the core, no tension at all, there's no power generated to run the city. The city goes dark. But if the reaction goes totally unmitigated, it melts down and destroys everything in a 50-mile radius.
So the diplomats are the control rods?
Yes. The diplomats are the control rods, constantly plunging themselves into the core to absorb the friction, keeping the reaction hot enough to generate wealth, but stable enough not to explode.
That is an exceptionally accurate mechanism to describe their foreign policy, and it really explains why they are forced to take radical, sometimes completely contradictory actions when the temperature in that reactor begins to change on its own.
Which brings us perfectly to the late 2000s, specifically the pivotal year of 2009.
Right, because the geopolitical landscape was shifting underneath their feet in a way that terrified the architects of this system.
The reactor was cooling down in a way that threatened their entire position. The region was integrating rapidly, fueled by the absolutely booming natural economic gravity of the Chinese economy.
And this integration was an undeniably massive and positive force. We're talking about colossal infrastructure projects, seamless supply chain integrations, and a sheer volume of trade that was lifting millions out of poverty and creating a profoundly interconnected, prosperous Asian economic zone.
Exactly. A totally peaceful, natural economic evolution that was bringing massive wealth to the region.
But this is exactly where the survival mechanics of the middleman kick in. For a state whose entire existence relies on balancing competing powers, an environment that naturally trends toward a single center of gravity is terrifying.
Even if that center is deeply committed to peaceful economic integration and regional harmony, it's an existential crisis for the toll booth operator.
A unipolar Asia, where economic and diplomatic relations flow seamlessly toward one dominant pole, fundamentally eliminates the need for an intermediary. The toll bridge is useless if everyone is happily traveling on the exact same side of the river.
So the scale is unbalancing naturally, not through aggression, but through simple, harmonious economic momentum.
And to maintain their highly specific artificial position, they realize they have to manually adjust the weights on the scale.
Which is where the files from 2009 become so fascinating. Because the individuals who stepped in to manipulate those scales are the exact same men who are now the prominent digital faces warning the world against Western hegemony.
We are looking at figures like George Yeo, who was then the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
They were not passive observers of this shifting dynamic at all.
No, they aggressively engineered a re-entry of American hard power. In 2009, they were the absolute key lobbyists for the architecture that Washington would eventually brand as the pivot to Asia.
They championed two massive specific mechanisms to ensure the U.S. remained deeply embedded in the region, right?
Yes. Economically, they heavily pushed for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. This was a massive trade bloc designed to establish American-led trade rules to structurally counterbalance the economic weight of China.
And physically, in terms of hard power, they initiated the expansion of the Changi Naval Base. They intentionally designed maritime infrastructure specifically to birth American nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and littoral combat ships.
The sheer physical weight of that decision is staggering when you look at it from the inside of the ministries. It wasn't just a quick signature on a treaty.
It was a massive logistical undertaking fraught with peril. Just think about the reality for someone like Lee, who was a senior desk officer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during this exact period in 2009.
We actually have accounts of what it was like in those rooms.
Yeah, Lee's reality was sitting in a dimly lit office at 3 a.m, having been awake for over 30 straight hours. His desk isn't covered in elegant diplomatic treaties. It's covered in sprawling, highly technical naval engineering maps of the Changi base.
Because the architectural requirements of that expansion were fundamentally political.
Exactly. Lane had to reconcile an impossible physical paradox. He was tasked with helping coordinate the design of a pier massive enough to accommodate the immense deep draft of a U.S. Nimitz-class aircraft carrier.
Which is basically a floating city.
Right. But the design had to remain subtle enough and civilian enough in its aesthetics and operational profile that it didn't look like a permanent American garrison to the watchers in Beijing.
He's staring at draft depths and concrete tonnage.
And what kept him awake wasn't patriotic fervor. It was a visceral, cold sweat fear of miscalculation.
Because he understood exactly what he was inviting into the region.
He really did. He remembered his own father, who had worked the cranes at the Sembawang shipyard during the height of the Vietnam War. His father used to describe the American sailors and their massive warships, not as democratic liberators, but simply as customers of the storm.
Customers of the storm.
And Lee realized, sitting in that sterile office in 2009, that he was executing the exact same maneuver his father had profited from. He was actively inviting a heavily armed giant into the house, specifically to ensure that the other giant in the neighborhood didn't lean too comfortably on the front door.
Even though that neighbor was just building a peaceful, integrated neighborhood.
Right. As Lee finally approved the memorandums that balanced the trade logic of the TPP with the hard naval logistics of the Changi Pier, the accounts describe him feeling this sharp, unglamorous cramp in his stomach.
He was paralyzed by the realization that this was not the elegant, theoretical diplomacy taught at Oxford or Harvard.
It was brutal, physical risk management. If the balance they were constructing with that concrete pier tilted by even a single degree, his children's future would be the first thing wiped off the map.
That physical reaction-like experience, that stomach cramp, that is the somatic reality of what we can call the transit fee doctrine. I know we need to unpack that because it sounds super academic, but it's the core of their entire philosophy.
Please do unpack it, because I'm genuinely struggling to reconcile the contradiction here. If you are actively lobbying a distant superpower to park its deadliest, most advanced warships in your harbor, and you're doing so to structurally counter the natural, peaceful economic growth of your largest trading partner, how do you look the world in the eye and call yourself a neutral bridge?
It looks exactly like choosing a side, just hiding behind the language of logistics.
So explain this transit fee doctrine to me and how it justifies this.
Okay. Imagine a highly profitable marketplace located in a valley between two large, distinct empires.
Okay.
If those two empires merge into one massive, unified territory, they will simply build a massive, frictionless superhighway right over the valley. The marketplace is bypassed, it dies.
Right, because there's no borders anymore.
Exactly. The valley only survives if the two empires remain distinct entities, slightly wary of one another, choosing to stop at the valley marketplace to exchange goods rather than integrating completely. In this scenario, neutrality does not mean being equally friendly to both sides or standing passively in the middle. Neutrality means maintaining the structural separation of the empires at all costs.
So if one empire begins to grow so prosperous and integrated that it threatens to naturally absorb the other side of the valley,
neutrality requires the valley to actively invite the other empire to build a fortress on the ridge.
Wow.
The goal isn't to help the fortress conquer the valley. The goal is simply to ensure there are always two distinct powers. The transit fee is the wealth the valley extracts for managing the friction between the two distinct entities.
So the invitation of the U.S. military wasn't an ideological alliance at all. It was literally just a heavy weight thrown onto the scale to ensure the reactor kept humming.
Their loyalty is strictly to the equilibrium itself, never to the actors placing the weights.
Loyalty to the equilibrium. That is a fascinating and deeply precarious way to view the world. And that strict loyalty to the equilibrium is exactly what explains the incredibly jarring 180-degree shift we are seeing in their public posture today.
Because the strategy from 2009, the pivot they engineered, it worked.
It worked too well. The U.S. forces returned, the presence was established. But the stable umbrella of American security presence that they invited in has evolved over the last decade into a geopolitical hurricane.
And the very architects who lobbied Washington to stay are now forced to completely reverse their public rhetoric, deploying every intellectual tool they have to cool the temperature down before the reactor melts.
The geopolitical gravity has fundamentally changed, and the parameters for survival have narrowed dramatically. In the 1960s, a hot war in Indochina was geographically distant enough to be highly profitable for the refineries and dry docks.
Today, the primary friction points are the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea.
Right. And a conflict in those waters is no longer a distant procurement opportunity. It guarantees the absolute immediate collapse of global shipping through the Malacca Strait.
It would mean the total economic asphyxiation of the island within a matter of weeks. The profitable anxiety has officially tipped into the realm of suicidal risk.
And their perception of the American role in managing that risk has degraded sharply. You can track this shift very clearly in the public statements of their leadership.
Take the remarks by Defense Minister Ng Hen at a recent Munich security conference.
Yeah, he systematically tracked the evolution of the U.S. image in the Asian region over the decades. He noted that they started in the post-WWII era, viewed broadly as liberators.
Then, over the last decade, that morphed. The U.S. became viewed as great disruptors.
Primarily due to unpredictable trade wars, sudden tariffs, and the ultimate irony, Washington's sudden chaotic abandonment of the very TPP trade agreement that Singapore had fought so hard to help them create.
And finally, Ng Hen arrived at the current state of perception. He stated that the U.S. is increasingly viewed in the region as landlords seeking rent.
We have to analyze that specific phrasing, landlords seeking rent, because it is devastatingly precise and deeply loaded.
In the context of Asian history, invoking the concept of a rent-seeking landlord is not a casual economic metaphor. It evokes the most painful, visceral memories of the colonial era.
It signals a deep, institutionalized mistrust of Washington's current transactional nature.
The implication is that the United States is no longer providing public goods, stability, or a reliable security architecture. Instead, it's viewed as an external power using its military presence simply to extract economic and political concessions from the region.
Essentially demanding payment for a protection that the region increasingly feels is actually causing the instability in the first place.
Especially when you contrast that with the unavoidable economic reality on the ground. China is a massive, indispensable partner.
And we really need to emphasize this point. The region is integrating incredibly peacefully and highly profitably. The supply chains are intertwined, the infrastructure is connecting the region, and it is driving absolutely massive economic uplift.
Fighting the natural economic gravity of that regional harmony just to appease a distant, increasingly unpredictable partner in Washington is viewed by the planners in Singapore as total economic suicide.
They recognize that regional cooperation and this natural, harmonious integration is the undeniable future. It's a profoundly positive force. So they have this massive, volatile risk and unpredictable external power in the U.S. that they somehow have to manage without triggering a catastrophic break.
Enter what we can call the YouTube strategy.
Yes, the YouTube strategy, which is much more than just a clever media campaign.
It's a vital component of statecraft. When you see figures like Mahbubani and Yeo appearing on global digital platforms, writing op-eds in Western papers, and giving these viral lectures, you have to understand they are executing geopolitical risk management disguised as digital content.
They are serving a highly coordinated, critical dual function for the state. Let's break down the dual function. The first function is what I would call the translation service. They utilize their flawless Ivy League calibrated English and their deep understanding of Western intellectual frameworks to package Asian perspectives for Western consumption.
They are taking the complex geopolitical shifts, specifically the peaceful rise of China and the natural integration of the Asian economy, and framing them for the West.
Exactly. Framing them not as aggressive maneuvers that require an American military response, but as a completely natural, historically inevitable, and entirely peaceful evolution of global economics.
They are actively trying to lower the temperature by making the East legible, rational, and completely non-threatening to the West. They are essentially providing diplomatic therapy to a declining superpower.
Diplomatic therapy.
They're trying to soothe the psychological shock of a multipolar world. But the second function is even more intricate.
Sophisticated. It's acting as a safety valve. This is where you have to look at what the state is doing physically versus what it's saying rhetorically.
Right. Physically, the Singaporean military, the hand of the state, continues to honor its agreements with Washington. It allows U.S. P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft to operate from its bases. It provides logistical support to the U.S. Navy.
The Physical Balancing Act remains in place. But simultaneously, these intellectuals, the mouth of the state, provide a massive rhetorical counterbalance.
They ensure that their regional partners, who are deeply committed to peaceful coexistence, do not feel cornered or threatened by the physical military cooperation happening right on the docks.
I'm trying to picture how this operates structurally. It's almost like a massive theatrical production.
So,
Well, you have the actors on stage, bathed in this warm spotlight, delivering these incredibly soothing, rational monologues to the audience about peace, natural economic evolution, and the harmony of the new century. That's the translation service.
right, keeping everyone calm.
But while they are speaking, if you look into the shadows above the stage, you see the stagehands frantically reinforcing the steel rigging, tying off massive sandbags, and bolting down the heavy sets so they don't crash down and crush the actors.
Analogy. The rhetoric and the physical logistics are entirely separate operations designed to achieve the exact same goal, keeping the theater from collapsing.
That rhetorical counterbalance is absolutely essential for their survival. It provides a seemingly neutral, highly intellectualized third-party validation for the shifting global order.
It is a desperate attempt to convince the West through logic and discourse that adapting to the new cooperative economic realities of Asia is fundamentally safer and more profitable than sparking a kinetic conflict over ideological supremacy.
Because a conflict would immediately destroy the very shipping lanes and economic networks that everyone, including the Western powers, absolutely relies upon. They are literally using diplomatic discourse as a shield against physical destruction.
Which brings us to the immense invisible human cost of this strategy. Executing this rhetorical counterbalance, acting as both the translator and the safety valve, isn't just a clever media trick that happens organically.
No, it requires a grueling, deeply institutionalized diplomatic effort to maintain the illusion of seamless neutrality. And it exacts a very heavy toll on the individuals who are actually tasked with holding that line day in and day out.
The lineage of this honest broker burden goes back to the very foundation of their foreign policy. It requires a discipline that is difficult to overstate.
Let's look at the historical precedent set by Lee Kuan Yew. He served as the vital, trusted intermediary between leaders like Deng Xiaoping and Chiang Ching-kuo during eras when official diplomatic channels across the strait simply did not exist.
He had to personally absorb the friction and the anxieties of both sides, serving as a completely neutral conduit for communication.
And we saw that fierce, pragmatic commitment to dialogue in action during really intense historical moments. Think back to August 1990.
The global political winds were shifting dramatically then.
Yeah, and much of the world was reacting with intense ideological grandstanding, actively severing diplomatic ties and isolating key actors.
But in the midst of that intense global pressure to conform to boycotts, Singapore deliberately maintained critical dialogue.
They proceeded with high-level meetings, including meeting with Premier Li Peng. They emphasized unequivocally that cooperative international relations and open dialogue must take precedence over isolation.
They distinguished themselves entirely through a pragmatic, result-oriented stance, ensuring that lines of communication remained open even when it was deeply unpopular in the West.
Because they recognized that isolation breeds miscalculation, and miscalculation leads to conflict. Today, that historical pragmatism translates into a razor-thin, incredibly complex hedging strategy.
You see it in the timeline of their modern agreements. In 2019, they signed a 30-year renewal with Washington, guaranteeing continued military base access. It is a massive physical commitment to the American presence.
But then, perfectly balanced on the exact other side of the ledger, they prioritize regional cooperation and resume extensive joint military exercises with China in 2022.
It is a meticulous, almost mathematical adherence to the core Augean principles of non-intervention and regional harmony. But the human reality of executing that mathematics is profoundly exhausting.
To really understand the humanity of the middleman, we have to look past the grand treaties and look at the individuals actually drafting the text.
The people in the room where it happens.
Exactly. Picture a woman named Maya. She is a brilliant young speechwriter working for a prominent Singaporean diplomat. The accounts of the diplomatic corps often highlight scenarios exactly like hers.
What's her setting?
We find Maya in a sterile, overly air-conditioned hotel room in Davos, Switzerland, during the World Economic Forum. It's 2 in the morning.
Truly, it's always 2 in the morning in these stories.
The room is littered with cold cups of instant coffee and crumpled, discarded drafts of paper. She is in the agonizing, microscopic process of pragmatic adaptation.
Trying to write the perfect speech.
Her task is to write a 15-minute keynote address meant to entirely de-escalate tensions and project absolute neutrality. But the mechanics of that writing are torturous.
Because every single word matters.
Every single time she crafts a sentence that acknowledges the American security architecture in the region, perhaps typing a phrase about maintaining open sea lanes, she is forced to immediately delete it, rewrite it, and shadow it with a dense paragraph affirming Asian sovereignty.
She has to constantly emphasize the undeniable benefits of regional economic integration and the paramount importance of peaceful cooperation.
She is experiencing a profound intellectual fatigue. It feels like speaking in endless riddles, engaging in a constant suffocating self-censorship just to avoid triggering the anxieties of either side.
She takes a break, turns on the hotel television, and watches her counterparts, diplomats from the superpowers, just shouting their blunt, uncompromising certainties on the global news networks.
And sitting there in Davos, she feels deeply envious of their luxury to be direct, to be righteous. Maya's vulnerability is the harsh realization that her entire career is designed to act as a human shock absorber.
She has to intellectually and emotionally absorb the massive impact of 2 geopolitical giants maneuvering around each other.
Meticulously crafting every single syllable so that the people back home don't feel the tremor. When she finally finishes that speech, it is undeniably a technical masterpiece of diplomatic balance.
But to her, it just feels like a heavy, restrictive suit of armor. Stifling, exhausting, but absolutely necessary to prevent her nation from being crushed by the very discourse it is trying to manage.
The psychological isolation of that position is profound. It pervades the entire diplomatic apparatus. When you are the middleman, operating under the transit fee doctrine, you can never truly agree with anyone in the room.
No, because full ideological agreement with one side is a direct breach of your own national security.
You are permanently alienated from the comfort of an alliance. You cannot have friends.
No.
You can only have stakeholders.
That is a painfully lonely existence.
You are constantly surrounded by essential partners. You are the hub of global connectivity, but you have absolutely no true allies. You stand entirely alone in the middle of the bridge you built.
It is an endless, thankless approach to foreign policy. You are perpetually managing everyone else's anxieties, absorbing their friction, translating their demands, and ensuring that the reactor never gets too hot.
And perhaps the cruelest part of this diplomatic posture is how success is ultimately measured.
Right, because you don't win territories. You don't secure glorious, historic victories that get written about in triumphant textbooks.
Success for Maya, for Lee, for Robert, is defined entirely 100% by the sheer absence of a disaster. If they do their jobs perfectly, shedding blood, sweat, and endless hours to maintain the balance, nothing happens. The world just wakes up to another day of trade.
Which brings this entire narrative full circle, right back to those 2 familiar faces appearing on your digital feed.
When you see them dissecting Western policy or eloquently championing the undeniable reality of the Asian century and the absolute necessity of regional harmony, you are not looking at hypocrites.
You are not looking at men who have suddenly changed their fundamental ideology. You are looking at the ultimate unyielding realists.
The instantaneous shift from happily fueling the American war machine in the repair docks of the 70s to actively lobbying for U.S. aircraft carriers in 2009 to now utilizing every global platform to preach against U.S. hegemony and advocate for peaceful integration, it is all driven by the exact same instinct.
It is the primal, unchanging instinct to ensure the grass isn't trampled when the giants shift their weight.
It is, from beginning to end, pure mechanics. The machinery of neutrality requires constant, agonizing recalibration. Every polished speech delivered at a Western think tank, every yard of concrete poured for a naval pier, every complex clause negotiated in a regional trade agreement. These are not distinct, isolated events.
No, they are heavily weighted stones, carefully, desperately, and deliberately placed on a perfectly balanced scale.
It leaves the island trapped in a perpetual, high-stakes performance that can never, ever end. A performance where the moment the brokers stop talking, the moment they fail to perfectly translate and manage the anxieties of the giants surrounding them, the friction they have meticulously harnessed for decades will instantly ignite and entirely consume the very sanctuary they built.